and gentlemen, I am Michelle Dunham, as you already know. I've already introduced myself, but I'm here this afternoon to talk to you guys about student engagement, and we're going to look at some of the whys and some of the hows. So why do we need to keep our students engaged all the time? And then, of course, most importantly, how can you keep your students engaged? Knowing why isn't going to do much good if you're not able to follow through and actually keep the children engaged. All right, so I am Michelle Dunham, Dean of Students, middle school math teacher. I have 14 years of teaching experience, all of it in the middle school, which is what makes me an expert on student engagement. If you have ever taught a classroom full of 8th graders, you know that this requires a great deal of energy and planning on your part. I have a degree that is specialized in mid-level education with emphasis on math and science. So today what we're going to be talking about, as I already said, is what is engagement? What does it look like when students are truly engaged? How will you know? The different levels of engagement, different types of engagement, and then also, again, most importantly, how can you engage your students? So engagement is not just entertaining your students, though this can be the beginning. This can be how you get them to come to you. I do like to think of myself as an edutainer. I try to be funny. You know, if you can get the kids to laugh, they're a lot more likely to listen to what you have to say next. So this is not just about entertaining your students. It's getting them to find the relevance in the schoolwork, to do it because they see value in it. So how do you know if your students are engaged? Anybody have any ideas about that? How do you know when your class is engaged? How do you know things are going well? I'm asking the question.
No, they ask questions.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, so if they're asking you questions while you're teaching, that is probably a good sign that they are engaged in what you're talking about. Okay, anybody else? How do you know when your students are engaged?
Some sort of production at the end.
Okay, they're creating something to show you. Okay. All right, so there are 3 different kinds of engagement, and we do need to engage our students in all 3 of these ways. We need to engage them emotionally, cognitively, and behaviorally to get the full picture. So when we're talking about emotional engagement, we're just looking at boredom versus interest. If you are standing in the front of your class lecturing for 45 minutes, even if you're a great speaker, your students are probably bored, okay? Cognitively, are you just having your students memorize things, or are you trying to get them to think more deeply, to come up with their own ideas, to think creatively, to solve problems? That would be real cognitive or intellectual engagement. Not just can they memorize the list, but can they apply that information in other ways? Behavioral engagement is basically just positive versus negative, and I think that most of us have no problem recognizing this part of engagement. If your students are disrupting your class, if your students are not completing assignments, those students are negatively engaged. So what does it look like? And I've got examples here for all 3 different types of engagement: behavioral, emotional, and cognitive, and then what it looks like when they're positively engaged, non-engaged, and negatively engaged. So with the behavioral engagement, if a student is positively engaged in your lesson, positively engaged in your classroom, as Nick said, they're going to be asking questions, they're going to be working on their projects, they're going to participate with enthusiasm, they're going to want to come to your classroom because they know that they're going to learn something new, and they already understand why they need to learn this material. A non-engaged student is late, absent, asleep, okay? or you might see them in the back of your 8th grade classroom. They look like this. So those students are non-engaged. And then the negative engagement, of course, is the disruption, the distracting of other students. For emotional engagement, positive engagement, of course, is interest. Then we have boredom for those non-engaged students, and rejection for the negative engagement. They just absolutely refuse to learn what you're trying to teach. And often that is because they just don't see the relevance. I'm sure you've all been asked that question, why? why are we learning this? And you should never, ever, ever answer that question with, I don't know. If you truly do not know, then you should find out. You should find out. How can we use this in our everyday lives? Why do we need this? I mean, one of the things that I explain to my students is, how are you going to explain to a class of 8th graders why they need to learn algebra? All right, well, because you're going to go to college. But some of them are not, and some of them don't care to. So what I explain to my students about why they need to learn algebra, I said, well, one, why don't we think about it for a moment? People have been learning algebra for thousands of years now. Why? Why, if it's not important, have we continued to teach it for thousands of years? And I just explained to them that if we don't teach it, we can't identify, the next Einstein. We can't identify the next Mendeleev. Maybe that's one of you sitting here in the classroom, and I will teach algebra to every single one of them so that they can all reach their potential, so that I can help in some way to identify those students who are going to take algebra to the next level. So if you don't know why you're teaching that material, you can't expect your students to want to learn it. So you need to find the relevance for yourself first. Okay, and then cognitive, positive engagement, they are going to meet or exceed your requirements. They're going to be turning in these amazing projects and assignments that include their own thoughts and their own ideas, not just regurgitating the material that you have given to them. Non-engaged students, they're turning in their work late, incomplete, or not at all. And those negatively engaged students are doing whatever they want to. Okay. Just basically redefining all the parameters of the assignment. So they may turn in something that has nothing to do with what you've asked. So there are different levels of engagement. High attention, high commitment. Obviously, this is what you want to see from your students. These are the students that are listening to you, participating in the class, asking the questions, answering the questions, challenging you with thought-provoking questions, making you study on your own when school is over in order to be able to meet their needs and answer those questions. Strategic compliance. Okay, obviously you want your students to comply with rules, but you do not want that to be the only reason that they are participating in your class, because they're complying, because they're doing what was asked. So when students are just complying, they're not really learning anything. Okay, they're not owning the lesson, owning the material, and making it a part of their lives. They're just doing what you ask them to. Why? Because you're the teacher. Why? Because they'll get in trouble with their parents if they don't. So yes, compliance is important on some level, but we do want to go above and beyond that. Retreatism, again, that's the disengagement, the sleeping, the boredom. Can I go see the nurse? Can I go to the comfort room? Yes, over and over again, day after day after day. They want to do anything that they can to avoid the class. And then you have outright rebellion, and I'm sure everyone knows what that looks like. So here we've got 3 different pie charts. This first one over here shows the highly engaged classroom. If you look at the highly engaged classroom, you see that most of the pie is green. Those students have high attention, high commitment, and that is based mostly on what you are doing as a teacher. And classroom management is a big part of this. If you have to manage your classroom well in the first place to be able to get the students engaged. In a well-managed classroom, you can see that this is classroom management. You've got the kids doing what you want. You don't see any of the blue open rebellion, but you see very little of the green high energy, high commitment. So it's not just about classroom management. Again, it's about challenging students intellectually, making it interesting for them. Okay, so when you're looking at engagement, some things you can observe, some things you cannot. Parts of this are inside of the child. They have to be engaged, cognitively. You can't see if a child is cognitively engaged in the lesson, though there will be signs. You can't see when you look at a child how they identify with your school, what's their sense of belonging, the school connectedness. So that's something that has to be worked on, as a whole team when we look at the effective parts of internal engagement. What you can observe, of course, is academic engagement. We can observe that in several ways. We look at grades, test scores, projects, homework completion, participation in class. And then behavioral, of course, attendance, suspensions. Are they participating in activities? Are they showing up on time? And so some of these things you can observe, others you cannot observe directly, but you can gauge based on the students' attitudes and behaviors. So now the fun part. How can you engage your students? Okay, so one thing that I like to do, and I know this is an old trick, and you guys are like, oh, come on, that's so boring. Call on the students randomly. I use this in so many different ways. One, when I am verbally questioning my students, I draw the name before I ask the question. And in this way, I'm able to differentiate instruction, allow my kids to be successful. I'm not going to ask a student something that they cannot answer. Okay, so by first drawing the name and then asking the question, then you're creating that environment where the student can feel successful. If the student feels successful, they're more likely to engage with you. You don't want them feeling embarrassed, ashamed. Okay, so that's one thing I do with my popsicle sticks is I use them to call on students randomly. I also use them for placing students in interactive groups. With lots of training in advance. For example, when I put my kids into interactive groups, they're not allowed to complain. They can't say, if they do, then we all do individual work. So they can't complain by look, sound, word, in any way, shape, or form. And they're quite good at that by now because, of course, they would much prefer to work in groups and do these fun activities. So calling on students randomly keeps students involved in the lesson, allows them to interact with you. If your students are not interacting with you while you are teaching, they are not learning. Okay? They have to be interacting with you. Group work. Let your students work together. They love this. I often am very surprised when I have my students working in groups to hear a student who is lower explaining something to another student. And, in that moment, they've internalized their learning. They will never forget what they have taught to their peer or to their friend that day. So in this group work, a lot of times you'll see students doing things that you did not know that they could do, things they would not have done for you, but that they're willing to do for their friend. Give them something to do. Okay, I teach algebra. You guys remember algebra? It's generally a boring class, right? Your teacher comes in all day long, they write equations on the board, they make graphs on the board, and they say things to you that don't make any sense, like it's rise over run, y equals mx plus b, and you don't understand any of it, but they just keep saying it again and again and again and again like they're speaking a foreign language. And then imagine our students, we really are speaking a foreign language and trying to teach algebra at the same time. So a lot of times they are just bored, lost, they're no longer listening to you. I have seen such an amazing difference in my algebra students since I started giving them scissors and glue and crayons. I have been creating, algebra color by number pictures. I'm also finding them on the internet, just cut and paste activities. I have found, different equations that we can stick on the wall so that they can go around in groups and just ask each other, is this a function? Is this a function? And, when I do that on the board, they won't even answer me. But if I'll let them go around, like it's a game, then they're explaining to each other, how do you know that's a function? I can't tell. Is this one a function? And they're teaching each other, again, what is a function and what is not a function. And you've taken some of the boredom out of algebra. So this young man here, I think my class is probably one of the only classes that he stays awake in. As Dean of Students, I hear complaints about this young man constantly. But as we can see here, he can be engaged. He can be involved. And it does take, some work on your part. But once you get him there, he's learning on his own and teaching others. So I think that a lot of times in the high school, we don't think about using these kind of activities. But, their eyes just light up when I get the crayons out. They really have a great time with it. So don't think that they act like they're too old, don't they? They're bored, they don't want to listen. But again, if you actually see them engaged in these activities, it's an amazing difference. Students need to move around. Let them get out of their seats. Do any of you guys do block schedules where you may have a 90-minute class? In a 90-minute class, do you keep your students sitting in a seat for 90 minutes? Yeah, I hope not. I hope you don't. Because if you are, again, there's no way that those students are actively engaged for 90 minutes. If you've got a block schedule, you need to break it up into several different activities. And in at least one of those activities, your students need to move. Even if it's just to change seats and get into a different group. But you've got to let the kids move around. Imagine how you feel after sitting all day in a seat listening to one person after another lecturing in front of you. It gets a bit boring. Sometimes you disengage, right? Maybe you didn't hear what the last person said. Okay, so you got to let the kids move around some if you expect for them to stay engaged. And I was a little bit worried about this at first because I'm big on classroom management. I don't like my students to be unruly. But they love it so much that they're actually better behaved when they're doing these types of activities than they are when I'm lecturing. Oh, wow, okay. Give your students choices. Okay, and again, this is part of taking ownership of their learning, and Miss Wendy was talking about this earlier when she was talking about doing the centers. Students like autonomy. Okay, of course, there are certain things that you need to teach them, but if you would give them a choice in how they show you that they've learned it, then they feel like they have more control over the whole learning process. So you don't have to offer, 12 options or 16 options. It could just be one or two to begin with. And you'll actually see that this is no harder for you than just grading the worksheets. So try, if you start slow and build up to lots of different options, the students, again, they have more ownership over their learning and their schoolwork, and they do appreciate it. Questions? Oh, I think I went way too fast. Does anyone have questions about student engagement? Yes.
In elementary, most of my students are so enthusiastic and so engaged. But what do you do when everyone is like that and one kid is that blue kid that's just going crazy? Well, I know I'm reaching all those. What did I do wrong with you?
I have one of those also, and he requires a lot of attention on my part. I have to touch him a lot. I have to give him special jobs and tasks to do. I have to really pick also who he's going to work with. I can't just, I said I randomly assign the groups. Again, like I randomly ask the questions, okay? If I draw the name and it's David, I might say, oh, Mark, you're in this group, because I'm not going to put the kids into groups that I know are going to cause problems. So while some of it is actually random, I also have a lot of control over the situation as well. So I place him carefully into groups. I give him a lot of my attention. I let him know how important he is all the time. Yes.
That's not easy.
No, it's not easy. It's very, very demanding. And that's just that one kid, and you've still got all the others as well. So, yeah, no, it's not, teaching's not easy. You know that. You've been doing it for a long time. It's not going to be easy. It never is. But I will say that I've been surprised that some of these things that seem difficult on the front end, gathering all these materials and supplies and finding all these resources, it has made my job not only easier, but more fulfilling. Seeing your students happy, when I'm able to go around in these pictures, my students did not even know that I was taking pictures of them because that's how engaged they were in the work that they were doing. And so being able to see that, it feels so good, and all that work that you put in on the front end was worth it. And then knowing too, next year, you don't even have to do it again. It's all ready for you, and you can just enjoy it next year and enjoy the fruits of your labor. Watch your students succeed. So sometimes it is a lot of work on the front end, but it is well worth it. Any other questions? Yes.
So I've had my own experience with this year, but it's one thing to have your own class being super engaged. Have you thought of any strategies on how to show others, how to, not just in this sort of setting, but your colleagues, if you notice that their class is maybe a disengaged classroom, strategies for showing them ways to do it without seeming,
Right, well, you could do this, and I have actually done this. Like, I might find an activity online, because I looked for it, and then be like, oh, I was just going, I was looking for something for my classroom the other day, and I actually saw this and thought that you might want to try that with your students, and then just give them the activity. Or so I've actually done that at my school. Yes. I saw this, and I thought that it was perfect for your content, and I knew you would want to use it. So. And then also we do sometimes small professional developments like this at our school just with our teachers. So you could offer something like that, take some of the ways that you engage your students and just do a little mini professional development for the teachers at your school where you could show them some of the different things that you do in your classroom. And honestly, a lot of the teachers that don't do it, it's because they don't know. Especially in the international field, people don't always have an education background when they come into education. So they may not have had all those same courses that you did about hands-on materials and things like that. So I found that Nick and I offered a professional development to our teachers about using hands-on materials and flip books and things like that. And so many of the teachers started doing those things right after the professional development. Like, I was amazed because, I've sat through many boring professional developments asking myself, what am I going to use from this? But I was really surprised to be going into their classrooms just days later and seeing them using those materials that we had offered to them. So maybe they just don't know. And if you could just show it to them, they'd be happy to use it. I hope. I hope that's the case. All right, any other questions? Yes.
Follow up, may I steal your slideshow, please?
Absolutely. Yep.
This is just a sort of very quick question. Seating plans, what do you prefer?
At the beginning of the school year, I have a seating plan that is completely organized by myself. I use that seating plan very strictly until I know all of the students' names and behaviors. And then throughout the school year, I release. I give them more and more freedom as the year goes on. By the end of the school year, my classes can pretty much run themselves. Like, if I did not come into the classroom, they would just start, So, yeah, initially I'm very, very strict with them about rules and procedures and where you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to do things, but I release control over time.
Would you sit them in groups or in a U or in individual?
I like to use different. See, we move our desks a lot. Just get up and move them around. And of course, my classroom, absolutely tiny. So I just moved into a much bigger classroom. Yay! So I'm going to have a lot more freedom with that now. But yeah, it was very difficult to arrange my class period because I had 19 students in a tiny, tiny room. In order to even get out of their seat, they had to actually move their desk and walk around. They couldn't even fit between the other students to walk up and down the rows. So I didn't have a lot of freedom in that at first. But yes, group seating is great, but I really don't recommend opening with that. Get to know your students first and so that you can place them in groups that are going to work. All right, thank you.